There are moments in life when everything you thought you knew about survival, about justice, about right and wrong, gets shattered in a single instant. Moments when the world tilts on its axis, and you find yourself doing something you never imagined you were capable of. This is the story of one of those moments, and I need to warn you right now, this isn't the story you think it is. When we think about the Mafia, our minds immediately conjure images from movies and television shows. Men in expensive suits, conducting business in dimly lit restaurants. Violence as a first resort. A code of silence that protects criminals from consequences. We imagine a world of clear-cut villains, where power is wielded without conscience and justice is whatever serves the family's interests. And in many cases, those images aren't wrong. Organized crime has left a trail of devastation through communities for generations, destroying lives, corrupting institutions, and creating cycles of violence that span decades. But what happens when that same power, that same ruthless efficiency, that same disregard for conventional rules, gets pointed at a different kind of monster? What happens when a man who's built an empire on fear decides that there are certain crimes he won't tolerate? Certain predators he won't allow to operate, even in the shadows where he himself lives. This is the story of Maya Alvarez, a 23-year-old woman from Newark, New Jersey, who lived a nightmare that thousands of women experience every single day in this country. A nightmare hidden behind closed doors, protected by silence, enabled by systems that claim to protect but so often fail. For 12 years, Maya endured an existence that slowly crushed her spirit, that made her question whether she deserved better, whether anyone would believe her, whether escape was even possible. And this is the story of Don Ricardo Moretti, the most feared man in Newark, a mafia boss whose name alone could end careers and settle disputes. A man with blood on his hands and power that stretched from the waterfront to City Hall. A man who should have been the villain in any reasonable story. But on one rain-soaked October night, when a desperate young woman fell to her knees in front of him and begged him to commit murder, Ricardo Moretti made a choice that would challenge everything you think you know about justice, about power, and about who the real monsters are. Before we begin, I want you to understand something. This story doesn't have clean lines. There's no perfect hero riding in to save the day. There's no simple ending where good triumphs over evil and everyone goes home satisfied. Real life doesn't work that way. Real justice is messy and complicated, and sometimes comes from places we'd rather not acknowledge. What happened between Maya and Ricardo that night would set in motion a chain of events that would expose a predator who'd operated with impunity for years. But it would also force both of them to confront uncomfortable truths about revenge, about accountability, and about what it really means to protect the vulnerable when the systems designed to do that job have failed completely. Maya's stepfather wasn't just an abusive man. He was part of something larger, something more insidious. A network of predators who'd learned how to game the system, how to manipulate the very people meant to stop them, how to use trust and authority as weapons against those who should have been safe in their own homes. And while prosecutors and police either looked the other way or actively helped cover up his crimes, Robert Chen moved through life with the confidence of a man who believed he was untouchable. He was wrong, but not for the reasons you might think. Because when Maya ran into that alley on that October night, when she saw those black SUVs and recognized the man standing at their center, when she made the split-second decision to approach the most dangerous person she could find and ask him to do something that terrified her almost as much as going home, she set something in motion that neither she nor Ricardo could have predicted. Ricardo Moretti had seen a lot in his 50 years. He'd witnessed betrayals that would break most people. He'd ordered actions that kept him awake at night, even as he justified them as necessary for survival. He'd built an empire on the principle that loyalty was everything and weakness was death. But standing in that alley, looking down at a young woman who'd been pushed so far beyond her limits that asking a mafia boss for murder seemed like her only option. Something shifted in him. Maybe it was because he had a daughter of his own, someone he'd protected from his world with everything he had. Maybe it was because even men like Ricardo have lines they won't cross, monsters they won't tolerate. Or maybe it was simply that he recognized something in Maya's eyes that he remembered from his own past, from a time before the Empire, when he'd been powerless and desperate and willing to do anything to survive. Whatever the reason, Ricardo didn't give Maya what she asked for that night. He gave her something far more dangerous and far more permanent. He gave her the kind of justice that doesn't end with a body in a shallow grave. He gave her the kind of reckoning that destroys a predator's ability to hunt ever again. Over the next 3 months, Ricardo would use every resource at his disposal, every contact he'd cultivated, every piece of leverage he'd accumulated over decades in organized crime. He would investigate Robert Chen with the same thoroughness he applied to business rivals and potential threats. He would uncover secrets that made his blood run cold, and crimes that made him question how someone like Chen had been allowed to operate for so long. And when he finally confronted Chen in an abandoned textile mill by the Passaic River, when he made the man confess every detail on camera, when he dismantled Chen's life piece by piece and left him with nothing but consequences and shame, Ricardo Moretti would prove something that most people never realize. Sometimes the most devastating revenge isn't death. It's exposure. It's accountability. It's taking away every protection and every weapon and leaving someone to face what they've done. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before we get to the confrontation, before we see how Ricardo methodically destroyed a predator who thought he was untouchable, before we witness Maya reclaiming her voice and her life, we need to go back to where it all started. We need to go back to that October night in Newark, to the rain that turned the streets into mirrors, to a young woman running through the darkness with nowhere left to go, to the moment when desperation met power and everything changed. Because this isn't just Maya's story, it's not just Ricardo's story, it's a story about what happens when the systems we trust fail us. About what justice looks like when it comes from unexpected places, about the complicated truth that sometimes the most dangerous people in our world are the ones who look normal, who blend in, who hide behind respectability and authority, and sometimes the ones we fear the most are the only ones willing to stop them. So if you're ready to challenge everything you thought you knew about justice and power and the lines between hero and villain, then stay with me. Because what you're about to witness will surprise you, disturb you, and maybe, just maybe, make you question whether the world is as simple as we like to pretend it is. This is the story of the night Maya Alvarez asked a mafia boss to commit murder, and the night he chose to do something far more devastating instead. Let's begin. The rain came down hard that October night in Newark, New Jersey, the kind of rain that turned the streets into mirrors, reflecting the neon signs of closed storefronts and the yellow glow of streetlights that barely cut through the darkness. Maya Alvarez had been running for 20 minutes, her sneakers soaked through, her thin jacket clinging to her shoulders like a second skin. She didn't know where she was going. She only knew she couldn't go back. Behind her, somewhere in the maze of residential blocks near the Ironbound district, was the house she'd called home for 12 years, the house where her mother had brought a man she thought would save them, the house where Maya had learned to walk on eggshells, to read moods like weather patterns, to disappear into her room and pray that tonight wouldn't be the night everything fell apart. But tonight had been different. Tonight, he'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Maya's breath came in ragged gasps as she stumbled into an alley between 2 brick buildings. Her ribs ached where he'd shoved her against the kitchen counter. Her wrist throbbed where she'd twisted it trying to pull away. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the fear that had been building inside her for years, the suffocating certainty that if she stayed one more day, she wouldn't survive. She pressed her back against the wet brick wall and tried to think. Her phone was dead. She had $17 in her pocket. Her mother was at the night shift at the hospital and wouldn't be home until morning. And even if she was there, would she believe Maya this time? Or would she do what she always did? Make excuses, beg Maya to be patient, insist that he was under stress, that things would get better. Maya closed her eyes and felt the rain wash over her face. She was 23 years old, and she had nowhere to go. That's when she heard the voices. They were coming from the end of the alley, where it opened onto a side street lined with warehouses and industrial buildings. Maya crept forward, staying close to the wall, until she could see 3 black SUVs parked under the awning of what looked like an abandoned textile factory. Men in dark suits stood in a semicircle, their faces hidden by shadows and the brims of expensive hats. And in the center of them all stood a man who commanded attention without saying a word. Don Ricardo Moretti. Everyone in Newark knew the name. Some whispered it with fear, others with a strange kind of respect. He was the head of the Moretti family, the man who controlled everything from the docks to the construction contracts, the gambling houses to the protection rackets. He was a ghost story and a living legend, a man who settled disputes with a phone call and ended careers with a nod. And Maya, soaked to the bone and desperate beyond reason, found herself walking toward him. The men noticed her immediately. Hands went to concealed weapons. A sharp command was given. But Maya didn't stop. She walked right past the guards, past the lieutenants in their tailored suits, until she was standing 3 feet from Ricardo Moretti himself. He was older than she'd imagined, maybe 50, with silver threading through his dark hair and lines etched deep around his eyes. But there was something in his gaze that made her think he'd seen more in his lifetime than most people could imagine. He looked at her not with anger or confusion, but with a kind of cold, assessing curiosity. And then Maya Alvarez, who had never asked anyone for help in her life, dropped to her knees on the rain-slicked pavement. The words came out broken, barely more than a whisper, but they carried the weight of every sleepless night, every bruise she'd hidden, every time she'd locked her bedroom door and prayed he wouldn't try to force it open. She begged him, begged the most dangerous man in the city to do something that terrified her almost as much as going home. She asked him to kill her stepfather. Ricardo Moretti's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the air around them, a tension that made the guards step back and the rain seemed to fall a little quieter. He studied her for a long moment, her torn jacket, the bruise forming on her cheek, the desperate wildness in her eyes. Then he did something that surprised everyone present. He reached down and helped her to her feet. The interior of Ricardo's car smelled like leather and cologne. Maya sat in the back seat, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, as the SUV glided through the rain-soaked streets of Newark. She hadn't spoken since he'd pulled her up from the pavement. She wasn't sure what to say. Part of her couldn't believe what she'd just done. The other part was too exhausted to care. Ricardo sat across from her, his phone in his hand, typing messages with the efficiency of a man who never wasted emotion. Finally, he put the phone down and looked at her. He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask what had happened. Instead, he told her 3 things that would change everything. First, he wasn't going to kill her stepfather. Not yet. Maybe not ever. That wasn't how he operated, and it certainly wasn't something he did because a stranger asked him to in an alley. Second, he was going to find out the truth. Every detail, every incident, every person who knew and did nothing. Because if there was one thing Ricardo Moretti couldn't stand, it was men who hurt people weaker than themselves and hid behind closed doors to do it. Third, he was going to make sure Maya was safe while he worked. She would stay in a property he owned, a small apartment above a bakery in the North Ward. No one would know she was there. No one would touch her. And when this was over, she would decide what justice looked like. Maya wanted to argue, wanted to tell him that she didn't need an investigation, that she'd lived it, that she knew exactly what kind of man her stepfather was. But the words died in her throat because for the first time in years, Someone was actually listening. The investigation began that same night. Ricardo's network was vast and efficient. Within hours, he had files on Robert Chen, Maya's stepfather, going back 20 years. Property records, business dealings, criminal complaints that had been mysteriously dropped, hospital visits by Maya's mother that were explained away as accidents. But what Ricardo found went deeper than anyone expected. Robert Chen wasn't just an abusive stepfather. He was a predator with a system. Over the past decade, he'd worked his way through 3 different families, always targeting single mothers with daughters. He'd charm the mothers, gain their trust, move into their homes. And then, slowly, methodically, he'd begin isolating the daughters, controlling them, threatening them, making them believe that if they spoke up, their mothers would be destroyed. 2 of the previous daughters had disappeared. One had moved to California and refused to talk about her past. The other had died in what was ruled a suicide, though the police report was thin and the investigation cursory at best. Ricardo's jaw tightened as he read the files. He'd seen monsters before. He'd dealt with men who killed for profit and power. But there was something particularly vile about someone who weaponized trust, who infiltrated families and used love as a tool for control. He made a call to his most trusted investigator, a woman named Lucia, who'd once been an FBI analyst before she decided the Bureau had too many rules and not enough results. Within 48 hours, Lucia had tracked down the daughter in California. She was willing to talk, but only if her identity was protected. The story she told was a mirror of Maya's. The manipulation, the escalation, the night she'd finally run, leaving everything behind, including her mother, because staying meant dying. But there was more. Robert Chen wasn't working alone. He was part of a network, a loose collection of men who shared information, strategies, techniques for grooming and controlling victims. They met online in encrypted forums. They traded advice. They celebrated their conquests, and they were protected. Chen had friends in the Newark Police Department, officers who'd buried complaints and lost evidence. He had a lawyer who specialized in intimidating victims into silence. He had a social circle that included judges and city officials who'd vouched for his character whenever questions were raised. Ricardo sat in his office in the back room of a restaurant in the Ironbound, the files spread across his desk, and felt something he rarely experienced: pure, cold rage. This wasn't just about Maya. It was about dozens of women and girls who'd been failed by every system that was supposed to protect them. And Ricardo Moretti, a man who'd built his empire on loyalty and respect, decided that Robert Chen's protection was about to come to a very public end. The abandoned textile mill sat on the edge of the Passaic River, a relic from Newark's industrial past. Its windows were broken, its machinery rusted, its floors covered in debris and the evidence of decades of neglect. It was the kind of place people avoided after dark, where shadows held too many secrets and the sound of footsteps echoed like gunshots. It was the perfect place for a reckoning. Robert Chen arrived at midnight, thinking he was meeting a potential business partner. He'd been contacted through a mutual acquaintance, told there was an opportunity for investment, that discretion was essential. He parked his BMW in the empty lot and walked toward the main entrance, his phone in his hand, confident in the way men are when they've never truly been held accountable. He didn't notice the cameras, didn't see the men positioned on the catwalks above, didn't realize he was walking into a trap until the doors slammed shut behind him and the lights came on. Ricardo stepped out of the shadows. Chen's confidence evaporated. He knew who Ricardo was. Everyone knew. And suddenly, standing in that empty factory, with the Mafia boss blocking his only exit, Chen understood that something had gone terribly wrong. Ricardo didn't rush, didn't raise his voice. He simply began asking questions. He asked about Maya, about the other daughters, about the network and the forums and the men who'd helped Chen evade consequences for years. Chen tried to deny everything, tried to play the victim, the misunderstood stepfather who'd only ever tried to provide for his family. But Ricardo had evidence, photos, testimony, hospital records, and most damning of all, he had Chen's own digital footprint, pulled from his laptop by Lucia's team. Messages that detailed his methods, his targets, his plans. The confrontation lasted 3 hours. Ricardo didn't touch Chen, didn't lay a hand on him. Instead, he did something far more devastating. He made Chen talk, made him confess every detail on camera, with the promise that if he refused, the evidence would go to every news outlet in the state, and Chen's protection would vanish overnight. Chen broke. Slowly at first, then in a flood of self-justification and excuses that only made his crimes more revolting. He talked about the other men in the network, named names, provided access codes to the forums, gave up his contacts in the police department and his lawyer's involvement in witness intimidation. And when it was over, when Chen was sobbing on the floor of that factory, Ricardo made his decision. He wasn't going to kill Robert Chen. That would be too easy, too quick, and it would make Ricardo no different from the predator in front of him. Instead, Ricardo was going to destroy everything Chen had built, every protection he'd relied on, every relationship he'd cultivated. He was going to expose him so thoroughly that he'd never hide again. The video confession was delivered to the FBI, the New Jersey State Police, and 3 major news networks simultaneously. The evidence was handed to a federal prosecutor Ricardo trusted, someone outside the network of corruption that had shielded Chen for years. Within 24 hours, Chen was arrested. Within a week, 6 police officers were suspended pending investigation. Within a month, the entire network was unraveling, and prosecutors in 3 states were building cases. But Ricardo's justice went further than the legal system. Chen's assets were seized, not by the government, but by Ricardo's accountants, who found creative ways to redirect funds to victim advocacy organizations and legal defense funds. Chen's house was sold, the proceeds given to the families he'd destroyed, his reputation, his social standing, his power, all of it vanished like smoke. And then Ricardo did something that would become legend in certain circles. He arranged for Chen to be placed in a federal prison where inmates had access to information about new arrivals. Chen's crimes were well known within days. His protective custody requests were denied through channels Ricardo controlled. His sentence became a living nightmare, exactly the kind of fear and powerlessness he'd inflicted on others. Ricardo didn't kill Robert Chen. He did something harder. He took away every weapon Chen had and left him to face the consequences of his actions for the rest of his life. 3 months after that rainy night in October, Maya Alvarez stood under a streetlight in Newark's North Ward. The autumn had turned to winter, and the city sparkled with early holiday lights. The bakery below her apartment filled the street with the smell of fresh bread and cinnamon. The world had kept turning, though Maya's had been fundamentally altered. She'd testified, not in court. Chen's confession and the federal evidence made a trial unnecessary, and he'd pleaded guilty to avoid spending his remaining years fighting a case he couldn't win. But Maya had testified to victim advocates, to journalists writing about the network, to other survivors who needed to know they weren't alone. Her mother had come to see her, eventually. That conversation had been harder than facing Chen. Her mother had cried, apologized, blamed herself for not seeing what was happening under her own roof. Maya was still working through forgiveness. Some wounds needed more time. But tonight, Maya wasn't thinking about her mother or her stepfather or the legal proceedings. She was thinking about the man who'd listened when no one else would. Ricardo Moretti pulled up in the same black SUV that had taken her away from that alley. He stepped out, dressed in a wool coat against the December cold, and walked toward her with the measured confidence of someone who controlled the chaos around him. Maya had asked to meet him, had something she needed to say. They stood together under the streetlight, breath misting in the cold air, while Newark hummed around them. Ricardo spoke first, his voice quiet but clear. He told her that justice wasn't always what people imagined, that sometimes revenge felt satisfying in the moment but left you empty after. That the hardest thing he'd ever learned was that real power wasn't in taking lives, it was in taking away the ability to cause harm. Maya listened, her hands in her coat pockets, her eyes on the street. Then she told him what she'd come to say. She'd wanted blood that night, wanted Chen dead in a way that scared her because she'd never wished death on anyone before. But what Ricardo had given her was something she didn't know she needed. The truth, exposed in a way that couldn't be buried. Accountability that freed not just her, but every woman Chen had hurt, and every woman he would have hurt in the future. Ricardo had shown her that justice didn't have to be about revenge. It could be about protection, about making sure the monster couldn't hunt anymore. As they talked, a light snow began to fall, dusting the streetlights glow with white. Ricardo reached into his car and pulled out his coat, draping it over Maya's shoulders the way he had that first night. He told her something then that she would remember for the rest of her life. He said that he'd spent 30 years in a world where violence was currency and power was everything. He'd done things he wasn't proud of and made decisions that haunted him. But the one rule he'd never broken was this. He didn't kill people just because they begged him to. He took their power so they couldn't hurt anyone again. Maya looked up at him, this man who'd terrified her that first night and then saved her in a way she never expected. And she understood. Ricardo Moretti wasn't a hero. He was a complicated man in a complicated world who'd made his own kind of justice in the spaces where the law failed. But on that October night, when a desperate woman had knelt in the rain and asked him to become her executioner, he'd chosen something harder. He'd chosen to dismantle a predator piece by piece, to expose a network that had operated in shadows for years, to give Maya and countless others something more valuable than revenge. He'd given them their voices back. As Ricardo prepared to leave, Maya stopped him with a question. She asked what would happen to her now, where she should go, what she should do with this second chance at life. Ricardo's answer was simple. He told her that wasn't his decision to make. He'd given her the tools to be free. What she built with that freedom was entirely up to her. Then he climbed into his SUV and disappeared into the Newark night, leaving Maya standing under the streetlight with his coat around her shoulders and the first real smile she'd felt in years on her face. 6 months later, Maya Alvarez enrolled in law school. She wanted to work in victim advocacy, to help women who were trapped the way she'd been, to navigate the legal system that so often failed them. It wouldn't be easy, but nothing worth doing ever was. And sometimes, late at night, when she studied in her apartment above the bakery, she thought about the Mafia boss who taught her that justice wasn't about death. It was about making sure no one could hurt you ever again. But the story doesn't quite end there. 3 years after that December night, Maya was working at a legal clinic in Newark when a file crossed her desk. It was a case involving a woman who'd been stalked by an ex-partner, a man with connections that kept him out of jail despite multiple restraining order violations. As Maya reviewed the file, she noticed something odd. The man's harassment had suddenly stopped 6 months ago. His business had collapsed. His friends had abandoned him. And he'd left the state, relocating to Arizona, where he now worked a minimum-wage job and kept a low profile. It didn't fit the usual pattern. Men like him didn't just give up. Maya made some calls, used connections she'd developed through her work, and what she discovered made her sit back in her chair and laugh quietly to herself. Someone had intervened, someone with resources and reach. Someone who'd made it clear to the stalker that his behavior would have consequences that went beyond the legal system. The file didn't name Ricardo Moretti, but Maya recognized the signature, the methodical dismantling, the loss of social capital, the quiet exile. She realized then that what had happened to her wasn't unique. Ricardo had been doing this for years, targeting predators the law couldn't touch, using his network not just for his own interests, but for a kind of shadow justice that operated in the gaps between what was legal and what was right. It didn't make him a good man. His empire was still built on activities that hurt people. His wealth came from gambling and extortion and businesses that exploited desperation. But it meant he was more complicated than the monster the newspapers described. It meant that sometimes, in the darkest corners of the city, the most dangerous man in Newark was also the one keeping certain victims safe. Maya closed the file and returned to her work. She'd learned long ago that the world wasn't divided into heroes and villains. It was full of people making choices in impossible circumstances, trying to survive and protect what mattered to them. And she'd learned that sometimes justice came from the most unexpected places. If you found Maya's story compelling, if you believe that real justice means protecting the vulnerable and taking away the power of those who abuse it, then subscribe to our channel. We share true stories that challenge what you think you know about right and wrong, about power and protection, about the people who operate in the shadows to protect those the light forgot. These are stories that don't have easy answers, but they're stories that need to be told. Subscribe now. There are more stories waiting, and some of them might surprise you even more than Maya's did.